The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the village green of St. Mary Mead, where the annual harvest festival had drawn nearly every resident from their cottages and gardens. Bunting fluttered between the ancient oak trees, and the scent of fresh-baked scones mingled with the earthy aroma of chrysanthemums arranged around the makeshift stalls. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on a wooden bench near the church wall, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm as she observed the familiar tableau of village life unfolding before her. From her vantage point, she could see Mrs. Dolly Bantry arranging her prize-winning preserves with theatrical precision, while Dr. Haydock sampled the Women's Institute cakes with the dedication of a man whose wife had put him on a strict diet. The new widow, Mrs. Ivy Thornfield, moved through the crowd like a pale moth, her black dress severe against the autumn colors. She had arrived in the village only 3 months ago, taking rooms at Rose Cottage after her husband's sudden death in London. The circumstances had been whispered about in hushed tones. A fall down the stairs, they said, though some suggested his heart had given out first. Miss Marple's keen blue eyes followed Mrs. Thornfield's progress through the festival, noting how the woman's gaze lingered on the old section of the churchyard, where the Victorian graves lay beneath tangles of ivy. There was something purposeful in her movements, despite the apparent aimlessness of her wandering. The elderly sleuth had learned long ago that people rarely moved without intention, even when they believed themselves to be merely drifting. The Reverend Leonard Clement was holding court near the tombola, his voice carrying clearly as he discussed the church's recent restoration fund. Beside him stood Colonel Melchett, recently retired from the constabulary, and Mr. Raymond West, who had driven down from London for the weekend. The conversation seemed animated, though Miss Marple caught fragments that suggested some disagreement about the church's financial priorities. "The old graves need proper maintenance," the Reverend was saying, his tone slightly strained. "Some of the Victorian monuments are quite deteriorated. The ivy has grown so thick in places that it's actually damaging the stonework." Colonel Melchett nodded gravely. "Historical preservation is important, certainly, but surely the living congregation takes precedence over the dead." Mr. West, Miss Marple's nephew, appeared uncomfortable with the topic. He glanced toward the churchyard with an expression she couldn't quite interpret. There had been something different about Raymond's recent visits, a distraction that seemed uncharacteristic of his usually focused nature. The festival continued its gentle rhythm until Mrs. Price Ridley's piercing shriek shattered the afternoon tranquility. The formidable woman stood frozen beside the church porch, her face drained of color, one trembling finger pointing toward the old section of the graveyard. "There's someone lying among the graves," she gasped. "I thought it was just someone resting, but they're not moving, and there's blood." The cheerful chatter died instantly. Dr. Haydock pushed through the gathering crowd, his medical bag already in hand, while Colonel Melchett followed with the brisk efficiency of his former profession. Miss Marple rose quietly from her bench, her knitting tucked safely in her bag, and moved with deceptive casualness toward the disturbance. Behind the ancient Pemberton monument, partially concealed by the very ivy the Reverend had been discussing, lay the still form of Mr. Arthur Graves, the village's elderly sexton. His grey head bore an ugly wound, and his clothes were disheveled as though he had fallen, or been pushed, against the weathered headstone. A small spade lay nearby, its blade stained with earth and something darker. "Poor Arthur," whispered Mrs. Bantry, pressing her handkerchief to her lips. "What could he have been doing back here? The graves don't need tending until spring." Dr. Haydock knelt beside the body, his examination swift but thorough. "He's been dead for some time," he announced grimly. "Several hours, I'd estimate. This wasn't an accident. Someone struck him deliberately." Miss Marple's gaze moved carefully over the scene, noting details that others might overlook. The earth around the Pemberton grave had been recently disturbed, despite the family having no living descendants in the village. Arthur's hands were dirty, but not with the general grime of gardening. This was the specific dark soil found only in the oldest part of the cemetery. Most curious of all, A small piece of black fabric clung to the ivy near where he had fallen. Mrs. Thornfield had pressed closer to the grouper, her pale face now flushed with what appeared to be genuine distress. "How terrible," she murmured. "Poor Mr. Graves was always so kind to me when I visited my husband's grave in London. He reminded me so much of the sexton there." The comment struck Miss Marple as oddly specific, particularly since Mrs. Thornfield had claimed her husband was buried in Highgate Cemetery, while Mr. Graves had worked exclusively in St. Mary Mead for 40 years. Small inconsistencies in grief-stricken memories were common enough, but Miss Marple had learned to pay attention to such details. As Colonel Melchett took charge of the scene and sent someone to telephone the police, Miss Marple retreated to her bench. The festival atmosphere had evaporated completely, replaced by the hushed tones and nervous glances that always followed sudden death. She resumed her knitting, her needles clicking softly as she watched the various reactions of her fellow villagers. The afternoon shadows grew longer, and with them the mystery deepened. Inspector Slack arrived from Much Benham within the hour, his motor car crunching purposefully up the gravel drive as the afternoon shadows lengthened across the churchyard. Miss Marple observed his familiar, brisk efficiency as he took charge of the scene, noting how his presence immediately transformed the scattered groups of shocked villagers into more orderly arrangements, as though tragedy required proper staging. The festival atmosphere had completely evaporated, leaving behind abandoned stalls and cheerful bunting that now seemed almost mockingly festive against the gravity of the situation. Mrs. Bantry had taken charge of organizing tea in the parish hall, while the Reverend Clement hovered anxiously between his pastoral duties and his obvious distress at the desecration of his peaceful churchyard. "Now then," Inspector Slack announced to the assembled group, his notebook ready, "I'll need statements from anyone who saw Mr. Graves today or noticed anything unusual about the churchyard." His methodical approach was reassuring to some, though Miss Marple had learned from previous unfortunate incidents that procedure alone rarely uncovered the more subtle aspects of human nature that often proved most illuminating. Mrs. Price Ridley stepped forward immediately, still clutching her handkerchief though her color had returned. "I saw him this morning around 10:30, Inspector, working near the newer graves. Nothing unusual about that. But later, I did notice someone moving about the old section. That area's been quite neglected, you know. The figure seemed smaller somehow, more delicate in movement than poor Arthur." Dr. Haydock approached with his preliminary findings. The wound was caused by a single blow from something with a sharp edge, not the spade found nearby. That appears to have been used for digging, though what Arthur might have been excavating is unclear. The actual weapon hasn't been located. "Digging," Colonel Melchett interjected, his military bearing evident even in civilian clothes. "What could he have been digging for in that section? Those graves haven't been disturbed in decades." The Reverend Clement shifted uncomfortably. "Actually, there has been some discussion about that area recently. The Church Council has been considering restoration work on some of the older monuments. The Pemberton grave, in particular, has been of concern. The ivy growth has loosened the foundation stones, and Arthur mentioned just last week that the ground around it seemed disturbed." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. In her experience, when graves were disturbed without obvious cause, the reasons were rarely innocent. She noticed how Mrs. Thornfield's attention sharpened whenever the Pemberton grave was mentioned, the widow's hands clasping tightly in front of her black dress, with a tremor that suggested suppressed anxiety rather than simple grief. Inspector Slack examined the scene methodically, crouching beside the small spade. "This tool's been polished recently," he observed. "Smells of beeswax, not the usual oil a sexton would use." Griselda Clement stepped forward, looking slightly embarrassed. "That would be my fault, Inspector. Arthur's usual spade handle split last week, so I lent him the church spade this morning. I'm afraid I polished it myself. There was a smudge I couldn't abide, and I used the furniture beeswax. Leonard, I should have mentioned it earlier." "That explains the scent," the Reverend said, relieved to clarify at least one mystery. Slack's sergeant approached with Arthur's personal effects. "Found this in his pocket, sir," he said, producing a folded, grubby quarter of paper. "Looks like it's from an old letter." The inspector flattened it carefully against the smooth top of the Pemberton stone. The letters were weathered and blurred, but the word at the bottom was clear enough. Ivy. Above it, fragments of an address, Mead, and what might have been a numeral. "Mrs. Thornfield," Inspector Slack addressed the widow directly. "You were seen in this area earlier today. Can you account for your movements?" The pale woman's eyes met his steadily, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her voice. "I often walk through the churchyard, Inspector. It's peaceful, and I find comfort there after my recent loss. I did see Mr. Graves working in the older section, but we didn't speak beyond a polite greeting." "Your husband is buried in Highgate Cemetery, I believe." "Kensal Green," she corrected automatically, then looked confused. "No, Highgate, of course. Forgive me, Inspector, grief muddles one's thoughts terribly." Miss Marple, who had known grief in many of its forms, reflected that while confusion was indeed common, true muddle rarely sat alongside such tight control of one's handbag and such careful attention to specific grave sites. Raymond West, who had been unusually quiet during the questioning, suddenly cleared his throat. "Inspector, I wonder if this might be connected to some historical research I've been conducting. I've been looking into local family records for a writing project, and I discovered some rather interesting documents about the Pemberton family from the Victorian period." This was the first Miss Marple had heard of Raymond's historical interests, and she found it curious that he hadn't mentioned such research during his recent visits. Her nephew was typically eager to discuss his literary projects. "What sort of documents?" Inspector Slack inquired, his pencil poised. "Financial records, mainly. Some rather significant sums that seemed to disappear from the Pemberton estate in the 1890s. There were suggestions of irregularities, though nothing was ever proven. I found the papers at the county archives just last week." Miss Marple observed the reactions around her with particular interest. Mrs. Thornfield's expression showed not surprise at this revelation, but what appeared to be recognition, as though she had been expecting such information to surface. Most tellingly, when Raymond mentioned his recent archival discoveries, the widow's grip on her handbag tightened noticeably. As the afternoon drew toward evening and Inspector Slack began organizing the formal investigation procedures, Miss Marple remained on her bench, her knitting providing the perfect excuse for continued observation. She had noted that Mrs. Thornfield's black dress bore a small tear near the hem, and despite the woman's claims of regularly tending to grief, her hands showed none of the garden soil that typically accumulated from such activities. The village was already beginning to weave its own narrative threads around Arthur Graves' murder. Theories of passing tramps, robbery attempts, and general wickedness, but Miss Marple understood that truth rarely resided in such obvious explanations. It lay deeper, buried beneath the polite surface of village life, hidden among the complex motivations that could drive ordinary people to extraordinary acts. As the crowd gradually dispersed, each person carrying their own theories and suspicions, Miss Marple caught sight of a small pressed sprig that had slipped from beneath Mrs. Thornfield's handbag clasp. It was ivy, carefully dried and tied with cotton thread, a curious keepsake for someone whose husband lay buried in a London cemetery, far from the ivy-covered graves of St. Mary Mead. The official investigation would follow its methodical course, but Miss Marple knew that the real mystery lay not in the obvious clues, but in the subtle patterns of human behavior that others might overlook. The afternoon had revealed much more than a simple murder. It had exposed the first threads of a web that connected past secrets to present violence, and she intended to follow those threads wherever they might lead. The grey morning mist that settled over St. Mary Mead seemed to muffle even the church bells, as if the village itself were observing a period of mourning for Arthur Graves. Miss Marple made her way along the familiar path to the post office, her umbrella tapping gently against the wet cobblestones, though her true destination was the natural gathering point where information flowed as freely as Mrs. Jameson's morning tea. The shop bell's cheerful chime felt almost inappropriate given the circumstances, but village life had its own rhythm that even murder could not entirely disrupt. Mrs. Jameson, her face bearing the particular expression of someone bursting with significant news, barely waited for Miss Marple to close her umbrella before launching into her account. "Such dreadful developments, Miss Marple," she declared, weighing out sugar with unusual care. "Inspector Slack was here not an hour ago, and what do you think they found when they searched poor Arthur's cottage? Nearly £50 hidden in a tea tin behind his kitchen dresser." £50? More than a sexton earns in half a year. Miss Marple accepted this information with the mild interest she reserved for the most significant revelations. How very surprising. Arthur always seemed such a careful man with money, neither extravagant nor secretive. That's exactly what I told the inspector, but he seemed to think it suggested something unsavory. Blackmail, he mentioned, though I can't imagine Arthur involved in such wickedness. Mrs. Jameson leaned closer conspiratorially. "Though I will say, Mrs. Thornfield has been asking the oddest questions since she arrived. Just last week she wanted to know about the church's burial records, particularly the older graves. Said she was researching family connections, but her questions were remarkably specific for someone supposedly unfamiliar with our local history." As Miss Marple made her small purchases, she reflected on this development. £50 was indeed a substantial sum, but blackmail seemed inconsistent with everything she knew of Arthur's character. More likely, it represented payment for services, perhaps assistance with some covert activity in the churchyard itself. Walking slowly toward the church, Miss Marple encountered Dr. Haydock emerging from Rose Cottage, his medical bag in hand, and his expression thoughtfully troubled. The cottage's convenient location, backing directly onto the churchyard wall, had not escaped her notice. "Good morning, Doctor. I trust Mrs. Thornfield is recovering from yesterday's shock." Dr. Haydock paused, clearly weighing professional discretion against natural concern. She requested something for her nerves, which seemed reasonable given the circumstances. However, I found her remarkably composed for someone claiming to be deeply affected. Her questions were quite clinical. She seemed particularly interested in whether Arthur might have had time to call out or identify his attacker before he died. The implication struck Miss Marple immediately. Someone genuinely concerned about Arthur's suffering would ask different questions than someone worried about what he might have witnessed or communicated. At the church gate, they found Raymond West in animated discussion with the Reverend Clement, both men appearing distinctly agitated. Raymond carried a leather portfolio that looked suspiciously official, and Miss Marple noted the careful way he handled its contents. "Aunt Jane," Raymond called out with obvious relief, "perhaps you could help clarify something rather extraordinary. The documents I mentioned yesterday have revealed something quite remarkable about the Pemberton family history." The Reverend Clement looked uncomfortable. "Mr. West has discovered records suggesting significant irregularities in the Pemberton burial records. The implications for our church's historical accuracy are quite serious." Raymond opened his portfolio carefully. The papers indicate that a substantial trust fund was established in the 1890s for a distant branch of the family. The last known recipient was a woman named Ivy Pemberton, but she seems to have vanished from all records around 1895, shortly after financial irregularities appeared in the main estate. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused momentarily. "And what became of this Ivy Pemberton, dear?" "That's the mystery. She disappeared completely, as if someone deliberately erased her from the family records. But the documents suggest she had rights to the ancestral burial plot, the very grave where Arthur was found yesterday." Inspector Slack's arrival interrupted their discussion. He approached with the determined stride of a man convinced he had solved the case, though Miss Marple had observed that such confidence often preceded spectacular investigative failures. "Significant developments," Slack announced. "The money in Arthur's cottage confirms our blackmail theory. Someone was paying him substantial sums to keep quiet, and yesterday that arrangement went fatally wrong. Mrs. Thornfield appeared at the church gate with the timing of someone who had been listening from a distance before deciding to approach openly. Her composure remained intact, though Miss Marple noticed the slight tremor in her carefully gloved hands. "Inspector," she said, her voice steady, "I couldn't help overhearing your discussion. I feel I should mention that Mr. Graves approached me last week about some historical research I've been conducting into my late husband's family connections to this area." This was the first mention of any such connections, and Miss Marple noted how smoothly the explanation was delivered. Mrs. Thornfield continued, "He offered to help me locate certain family documents that might be interred with some of the older graves. I paid him a modest sum for his assistance, though we hadn't yet begun the actual work." Inspector Slack's satisfaction was evident. "So you were paying him to help disturb graves? That's highly irregular, Mrs. Thornfield." "Not to disturb them, Inspector, merely to research their contents through church records. My husband's family had connections to the Pemberton line, and I hoped to trace certain documents that might have been buried with family members. It's not uncommon in Victorian times for important papers to be interred with the deceased." The explanation satisfied Inspector Slack, but Miss Marple recognized it as a carefully constructed half-truth. Mrs. Thornfield was indeed searching for something connected to the Pemberton grave, but her motivations were far more complex than simple genealogical research. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered near the church gate, ostensibly arranging the chrysanthemums she had brought for Arthur's eventual memorial, but actually observing the subtle interplay of glances between the various parties. Mrs. Thornfield's eyes followed Raymond West with particular attention, while her nephew seemed unusually eager to avoid prolonged conversation with the widow. The morning's revelations had added new layers to the mystery, but Miss Marple sensed that the truth lay not in Inspector Slack's straightforward blackmail theory, but in the more complex web of deception that connected Mrs. Thornfield's arrival, Raymond's mysterious research commission, and Arthur Graves's unfortunate discovery of whatever secrets lay buried beneath the ivy-covered stones of the old churchyard. The £50 suggested not extortion, but payment for services rendered, services that had ultimately cost Arthur his life. The grey morning mist that had settled over St. Mary Mead seemed reluctant to lift, clinging to the churchyard stones like secrets unwilling to be revealed. Miss Marple made her way along the familiar path, her umbrella tapping gently against the wet cobblestones as she observed how tragedy had altered the village's natural rhythms. The post office buzzed with subdued activity, and she could see through the windows that Mrs. Jameson was holding court with her usual authority, though her gestures carried the particular animation that accompanied truly significant news. Inside, the shop bell's cheerful chime seemed almost inappropriate, but Mrs. Jameson's expression immediately conveyed the gravity of recent developments. "Such extraordinary things have come to light, Miss Marple," she declared, her voice dropping to the conspiratorial tone reserved for the most important revelations. "Inspector Slack was here not 2 hours ago, and what do you suppose they discovered when they searched poor Arthur's cottage? Nearly £50 hidden in a tea tin behind his kitchen dresser. £50. More money than a sexton sees in half a year." Miss Marple accepted this information with her customary mild interest, though her sharp mind immediately began calculating the implications. How very unusual. Arthur was always so methodical about his finances, neither secretive nor extravagant in his habits. "Precisely what I told the inspector," Mrs. Jameson continued, leaning across the counter. "But he seems convinced it points to blackmail, though I cannot imagine Arthur involved in such sordid business. The sum troubles me, though. It seems both too much and too little, if you understand my meaning." As Miss Marple completed her small purchases, she reflected that Mrs. Jameson's instinct was sound. £50 represented significant money, but hardly the fortune that would justify murder if simple extortion were the motive. The amount suggested payment for services rather than silence. But what services might Arthur have provided that commanded such compensation? Her contemplation was interrupted by the arrival of a distinguished gentleman in a well-tailored coat, who introduced himself as Mr. Percival Fortescue, a solicitor from London. His presence in the village, particularly so soon after Arthur's murder, struck Miss Marple as remarkably coincidental. "I'm seeking the Reverend Clement," Mr. Fortescue explained to Mrs. Jameson. "I have urgent business regarding certain legal matters that may be connected to recent events in your churchyard." Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance as the solicitor made his way to the vicarage, her curiosity thoroughly aroused. Through the study window, she could observe an animated conversation between Mr. Fortescue and the Reverend, though only fragments of their discussion carried clearly. "The Pemberton Trust has been dormant for 30 years, she heard the solicitor saying, "but recent inquiries have activated certain legal obligations. The estate could be quite substantial by now, if the proper claimant can establish legitimate lineage." The Reverend's response was inaudible, but his visible agitation suggested complications beyond routine legal procedures. Miss Marple had observed that dormant inheritances possessed a peculiar ability to attract both genuine heirs and accomplished fraudsters, often in equal measure. Her observation was interrupted by Inspector Slack's arrival, his confident bearing suggesting a man convinced of his investigative success. "Miss Marple," he nodded briskly, "I don't suppose you've noticed anything particular about Mrs. Thornfield's activities. We've received some rather illuminating information about her background." Before she could respond, Mrs. Thornfield herself emerged from Rose Cottage with timing that suggested careful observation from her windows. Today she carried a small leather portfolio, and her usual pallor had given way to a slight flush that might indicate either excitement or anxiety. "Inspector," she called, her voice carrying clearly, "I was hoping to speak with you. I've discovered some important documents among my late husband's papers that may prove relevant to your investigation." The leather case contained what appeared to be genealogical certificates and correspondence, all meticulously organized. Mrs. Thornfield spread them carefully on her garden table, her movements precise and deliberate. "My husband was more thorough in his family research than I initially realized," she explained. "These documents establish a clear connection between his lineage and the Pemberton family. More specifically, they suggest his great-grandmother was the Ivy Pemberton mentioned in yesterday's discussions." Mr. Fortescue examined the papers with professional interest, though his expression remained carefully neutral. "These appear authentic," he conceded. "However, proving genealogical connection and establishing legal claim represent quite different challenges." Raymond West appeared at that moment, his own portfolio conspicuously absent, and his expression troubled. "I'm afraid there's been a complication with my research," he announced. "The documents I discovered at the county archives have been recalled by their original depositor. Apparently, someone with greater legal standing has claimed ownership of the entire collection." Miss Marple noted the sharp glance exchanged between Mrs. Thornfield and her nephew, a look that suggested prior communication about this convenient development. The timing seemed remarkably fortuitous, removing potentially contradictory evidence, precisely as Mrs. Thornfield presented her own documentation. Dr. Haydock approached from the church direction, his medical bag suggesting continued examination of the crime scene. "Inspector, I've discovered something rather curious. There are traces of different soil under Arthur's fingernails. Not the dark earth from the old churchyard section, but lighter clay, more common in the newer burial areas." This revelation clearly puzzled Inspector Slack, whose theory required Arthur to have been killed while working exclusively on the Pemberton grave. Miss Marple, however, found it illuminating, suggesting Arthur had been conducting broader activities, possibly comparing soil samples or searching for something specific across multiple locations. As the group began to disperse, Miss Marple lingered near the church gate, ostensibly arranging the chrysanthemums she had brought for Arthur's memorial. Her true purpose was observing the subtle interplay of glances and reactions among the various parties. Mrs. Thornfield's eyes followed Raymond with particular attention, while her nephew seemed unusually eager to avoid prolonged conversation with the widow. The morning's revelations had added complexity to the mystery, but Miss Marple sensed the truth lay not in Inspector Slack's straightforward blackmail theory, but in the more intricate web connecting Mrs. Thornfield's convenient arrival, Raymond's mysterious research complications, and Arthur's fatal discovery of whatever secrets lay buried beneath the ivy-covered stones. The £50 suggested not extortion, but payment for services that had ultimately cost Arthur his life, services that someone was now desperately trying to conceal. The afternoon settled into that peculiar quiet that follows shocking events, when ordinary activities feel somehow inappropriate, yet must continue. Miss Marple found herself drawn once again toward the church, though she took the longer path through the village, her mind turning over the morning's revelations like a careful gardener examining soil for hidden roots. The £50, the genealogical documents, the convenient timing of various discoveries, all suggested a complexity that Inspector Slack's straightforward theories could not adequately address. Her first destination was the vicarage, where she arrived with a small jar of damson jam for Griselda, that most useful of social currencies in village life. The Reverend Clement appeared harassed, his usual gentle composure strained by the afternoon's parade of official visitors. Mr. Fortescue had departed only an hour earlier, leaving behind an atmosphere of legal complications and unresolved questions. "Such a trying day, Leonard," Griselda was saying as she poured tea. "First the inspector with his questions about church records, then that solicitor with his talk of trusts and claimants. One hardly knows what to make of it all." Miss Marple accepted her cup with grateful murmurs, though her attention was caught by a faint, sweet fragrance that seemed oddly out of place in the vicarage's typically austere atmosphere. It was delicate and old-fashioned. Violets, perhaps, or the sort of scented powder that had been fashionable in her grandmother's time. As Griselda bustled about, arranging biscuits with the particular care reserved for unexpected guests, Miss Marple's knitting needles slipped from her fingers and rolled beneath the coat stand near the vestry door. When the Reverend stooped to retrieve it, his movement revealed that one of the vestry keys was missing from its customary hook. Arthur often kept one for convenience, Griselda explained quickly, noticing their attention. He had such a conscientious fear of being locked out during his duties. The explanation seemed reasonable, yet Miss Marple recalled Arthur's meticulous nature with keys and his frequent admonishments to the choir boys about proper security. As she sipped her tea, Earl Grey, she noted, Griselda's preferred extravagance, the sweet scent lingered, suggesting recent presence rather than lingering memory. After expressing appropriate sympathy and concern, Miss Marple made her way to Arthur's cottage, where she found Mrs. Ellen Pierce, his widowed sister, setting the small household to rights with the determined efficiency of practical grief. Ellen was a neat, capable woman whose sorrow expressed itself through vigorous cleaning rather than idle tears. "He was in such good spirits yesterday morning, Miss Marple," Ellen confided, leading her into the tiny parlor. "Said he had a bit of extra work for the church that might earn him a shilling or two. Not blackmail, mind you. Arthur had his failings, but never that sort of wickedness." Miss Marple's observant eye took in the details of the modest room, noting particularly the small round table where 2 teacups sat ready for washing. The faint rings on the saucers told their own story, one darker and strongly tannic, clearly Arthur's plain brew, while the other bore the distinctive bergamot fragrance of Earl Grey. Few residents of St. Mary Mead kept such tea, and fewer still would have visited Arthur's humble cottage for social purposes. More telling still was the delicate smear of plum-colored lipstick on the rim of the finer cup, and the single crumb of what appeared to be Bath bun on a small plate. These details painted a picture of a visitor who was both refined and deliberately inconspicuous, someone who would bring her own refreshments to ensure a proper social atmosphere. "Did Arthur mention expecting a visitor yesterday?" Miss Marple inquired gently. Ellen shook her head, then paused thoughtfully. "Though, now you mention it, he did say something about arrangements being made for some work on the old Pemberton rail. Said the council needn't worry about the expense because it was already sorted. He had that way of speaking when his mind was made up about something." As Ellen continued her tidying, she produced a folded receipt that had slipped beneath the breadboard. "He never liked loose papers cluttering about," she said with mild annoyance. The receipt from Tom's the ironmonger showed the purchase of a small padlock, twine, and paraffin, items suggesting preparation for some specific task rather than routine maintenance. Miss Marple thanked Ellen for her time and made her way toward the churchyard, her mind cataloguing the accumulating evidence. The cottage visit had confirmed her growing suspicion that Arthur's death was connected not to blackmail, but to services he had agreed to provide, services that had ultimately proved fatal. The churchyard lay quiet in the late afternoon light, the festival decorations now seeming almost mockingly cheerful against the somber reality of recent events. Miss Marple approached the Pemberton grave with careful attention, noting details that the official investigation might have overlooked in its focus on obvious clues. The ivy that covered the ancient monument was indeed thick and tangled, as the Reverend had described, but Miss Marple's experienced eye detected signs of recent disturbance beyond the obvious excavation. Some of the younger shoots had been carefully bent aside rather than broken, suggesting someone familiar with the proper handling of such growth. The earth around the grave showed multiple disturbances, indicating repeated visits rather than a single violent encounter. Kneeling carefully beside the monument, Miss Marple examined the base where Arthur's body had been discovered. Hidden deep within the ivy's embrace, her searching fingers found a small, hard object that glinted faintly in the filtered sunlight. It was a tiny fragment of mother of pearl, no larger than her smallest fingernail, polished smooth on one side and roughly broken on the other. The piece was clearly not from any church furnishing, nor from Arthur's simple possessions. It spoke of something refined, perhaps ornamental, and certainly out of place in the rustic churchyard. As she carefully wrapped the fragment in her handkerchief, Miss Marple became aware of a faint, lingering fragrance in the air around the grave, the same sweet, old-fashioned scent she had noticed at the vicarage. It was barely perceptible, easily dismissed as imagination, yet it reinforced her growing certainty that this site had been visited recently by someone whose presence left subtle but definite traces. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple." The soft voice startled her from her contemplation. Mrs. Thornfield stood nearby, dressed today in muted gray rather than her customary black, carrying a single white lily which she placed carefully on a grave several monuments away from the Pemberton site. "A beautiful afternoon for quiet reflection," Miss Marple replied, rising carefully from her examination of the ivy. Mrs. Thornfield's pale eyes flickered momentarily toward the Pemberton grave, her expression tightening almost imperceptibly. "The churchyard holds so many stories, doesn't it? Some, I imagine, are best left undisturbed." The comment carried a peculiar weight, almost like a warning delivered in the gentlest possible terms. Miss Marple smiled with characteristic mildness. "Perhaps so, dear. But sometimes the past insists on making itself known, no matter how carefully it has been buried." Mrs. Thornfield's composure wavered slightly, a barely visible tremor passing through her carefully controlled features. "Yes," she murmured, "I suppose that's true." With a polite farewell she departed, her footsteps rustling softly through the fallen leaves. Miss Marple remained by the grave, the small fragment of mother of pearl warm in her pocket. The afternoon's discoveries had confirmed her suspicions while raising new questions. Arthur Graves had not been killed for what he knew, but for what he was in the process of finding. The evidence suggested not simple blackmail or even inheritance fraud, but something far more personal and potentially damaging. Secrets that someone was prepared to kill to protect. As the shadows lengthened across the churchyard, Miss Marple made her way home, her mind already turning toward the next phase of her quiet investigation. The truth lay buried not just beneath the ivy-covered stones, but in the complex web of relationships and motivations that connected the various players in this tragic drama. Tomorrow would bring new developments, but tonight she would consider carefully what she had learned and plan her next gentle but determined steps toward uncovering the full truth behind Arthur Graves's untimely death. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her familiar parlor chair, the small fragment of mother-of-pearl resting on the table beside her teacup, catching the lamplight with an opalescent gleam that spoke of quality and careful craftsmanship. She had made a brief list in her neat handwriting, observations that refused to align with Inspector Slack's straightforward theories. The Earl Grey at Arthur's cottage, the violet scent at both the vicarage and the gravesite, the missing vestry key, and now this delicate fragment that seemed so utterly out of place in a village churchyard. Her contemplation was interrupted by hurried footsteps on the garden path. Mrs. Bantry appeared at her door, slightly breathless and with an expression that suggested news of considerable importance. "Jane, I must speak with you immediately," she declared, settling into the offered chair with unusual urgency. "I've just returned from Much Benham, where I had tea with my cousin Margaret at the registry office. She mentioned the most extraordinary thing about a woman who came inquiring about death certificates from the 1890s. Someone asking remarkably specific questions about whether certain deaths had been properly recorded." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused. "How very interesting, dear. Did this woman give her name?" "That's the remarkable part. She signed as Mrs. I. Pemberton, though Margaret said she seemed nervous about writing it, as though the name didn't sit naturally with her." Mrs. Bantry leaned forward conspiratorially. "But Jane, there's something else. Yesterday at the festival, I noticed Mrs. Thornfield's powder compact when she dropped it at my stall. Mother of pearl with a distinctive chip along the edge, and when she snapped it shut, there was the faintest breath of violets." The connection struck Miss Marple with quiet certainty. She produced the fragment from her reticule, watching Mrs. Bantry's expression change to one of recognition. "My dear Jane, that looks remarkably like a piece from old Lady Pemberton's dressing table, the one with the secret compartments that vanished after her death in the 1890s. There was quite a scandal about it, though it was hushed up at the time. The table had the most exquisite mother-of-pearl inlay work, imported from France." Miss Marple absorbed this information with growing understanding. A valuable family heirloom that had mysteriously disappeared, now represented by a fragment found at the scene of Arthur's murder. The implications were becoming clearer. The following morning brought Raymond to her door, looking unusually troubled. "Aunt Jane, I must confess something rather awkward. 3 months ago, I was approached by a woman calling herself Mrs. Grey to conduct historical research into the Pemberton family line. She paid in advance and seemed particularly urgent about establishing certain genealogical connections." "And you've since recognized this Mrs. Grey?" Raymond nodded miserably. "When Mrs. Thornfield spoke at the church gate yesterday, I realized they were the same person. Her letters were on heavy cream paper with a distinct violet fragrance, and her questions were remarkably specific about trust funds and inheritance rights." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly as she processed this revelation. "What exactly did your research uncover, dear?" "References to financial irregularities in the 1890s and mentions of an Ivy Pemberton who seemed to vanish from all official records around 1895. I was meant to examine the church burial registers for confirmation, but Arthur said they were being rebound. He promised to check specific dates for me and leave a note at the vestry if he found anything significant." "But you never received such a note?" "Nothing. And now the archival documents I was working from have been recalled by someone claiming greater legal standing to the material." Miss Marple made her way to the churchyard, her mind weaving together the accumulating threads of evidence. At the Pemberton grave, she knelt among the ivy with the careful attention of someone seeking confirmation rather than discovery. The iron railing showed fresh screw marks where a small padlock had recently been attached, and nearby lay fragments of twine with weathered ends and a cleanly cut middle, evidence of something hastily secured and then removed. Most tellingly, the soil showed a shallow rectangular depression, as though a box or package had been buried and then retrieved. When she touched the earth lightly, her glove came away with a faint, sweet residue that carried the unmistakable scent of violets. From the path came voices. Mrs. Thornfield and Mr. Fortescue approaching in earnest discussion. The widow's eyes immediately took in Miss Marple's position near the grave, darting to the iron railing and the disturbed soil before settling with visible effort on the lily she had placed there the day before. Miss Marple, Mr. Fortescue acknowledged smoothly, "An unfortunate business. I'm advising Mrs. Thornfield on delicate matters concerning trust administration." "How very interesting," Miss Marple replied mildly. "Trusts can be such curious creatures. One feeds them carefully for years, yet they can still bite quite unexpectedly." Mrs. Thornfield's lips made the smallest involuntary movement, not quite a smile. "I assure you, Miss Marple, I have no intention of being bitten." After they passed, Miss Marple remained kneeling, her mind assembling the complete picture. Arthur had been paid not for silence, but for a specific service, to locate and retrieve something that had been hidden in the Pemberton grave decades ago. The missing dressing table, the vanished Ivy Pemberton, the financial irregularities of the 1890s, and Mrs. Thornfield's elaborate deception all connected in a web of fraud that had ultimately cost Arthur his life. Hidden beneath the moss at the base of the yew tree, she found one final piece of evidence, a small brass key with a worn bow, around which was tied the narrowest strip of faded purple ribbon. The key to whatever secrets had been buried with the Pemberton family treasure, and perhaps to the truth behind Arthur Graves' murder. As she walked home through the lengthening shadows, Miss Marple reflected that the case was far from over. Mrs. Thornfield had successfully retrieved whatever evidence threatened her claims, but in doing so, she had left a trail of small betrayals that would ultimately lead to her exposure. The truth, as always, lay not in dramatic revelations, but in the accumulation of seemingly insignificant details that revealed the human heart in all its complexity. The brass key with its faded purple ribbon lay beside Miss Marple's evening teacup, catching the lamplight with the dull gleam of old secrets. She had spent the quiet hours since dinner turning it over in her palm, considering its implications while the village settled into its customary evening rhythms. Through her cottage window, she could observe the familiar silhouettes of St. Mary Mead, the church spire against the darkening sky, the gentle glow from neighboring windows, and the soft movement of shadows that spoke of ordinary lives continuing their peaceful courses. It was nearly midnight when a different sort of movement caught her attention. A small, careful light traced across the interior of the church vestry, appearing and disappearing with the deliberate precision of someone who knew exactly which corners to avoid and which tasks required illumination. Miss Marple remained at her window, understanding that some secrets revealed themselves more completely when observed from a distance. The faint sound of metal meeting metal drifted across the still air, a key turning with practiced confidence, followed by the softest whisper of papers being handled with urgent care. The morning brought Dr. Haydick to her door, his medical bag suggesting official business but his expression carrying the weight of personal concern. He accepted her offer of tea with the careful manner of a man choosing his words before speaking them. "I've completed my examination of Arthur's effects," he began, settling into the familiar chair beside her fireplace. There were traces of violet-scented powder beneath his fingernails and fibers from expensive wool caught in his jacket buttons. Most significantly, the head wound shows evidence of contact with something smooth and curved. Not a garden tool, but perhaps an ornamental object with mother-of-pearl inlay. Miss Marple's knitting needles moved steadily as she absorbed this confirmation of her growing suspicions. The physical evidence aligned perfectly with her mental reconstruction of events, painting a picture of deliberate violence rather than sudden passion. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Reverend Clement, his usually serene expression marked by considerable distress. "Miss Marple, I wonder if you might assist with a rather troubling discovery. The parish registers have been disturbed, specifically the burial records from 1895. At the church vestry, Miss Marple examined the evidence of careful tampering. One page had been torn away entirely, leaving only a small fragment clinging to the binding thread. On it, a penciled notation remained partially visible. "Ride W out service by wish of I." The Reverend's predecessor had clearly made personal annotations that someone now found inconvenient. "Arthur mentioned these irregularities to me just last week," the Reverend continued. "He was quite concerned about someone asking very specific questions regarding what might have been interred with certain family members. He said the records needed to be completely accurate, as though he feared they might be challenged." Ellen Pierce arrived as they examined the damaged register, her practical grief sharpened by indignation at this fresh violation. "It's wicked to steal from the dead and the church both," she declared. "Arthur told me not 2 days ago that when work is done proper, the proof sits quiet as a mouse. He said he'd moved something to where no one would think to look because it's new, and people's minds stay where the ivy is." Miss Marple's attention sharpened at this cryptic reference. Arthur's methodical nature would have led him to secure important evidence in an unexpected location, somewhere that challenged assumptions about age and reverence. At the post office, Mrs. Jameson provided the morning's most significant revelation. "Inspector Slack has been making inquiries about Mrs. Thornfield's background," she confided. "Her marriage certificate lists her maiden name as Ivy Pemberton Gray, and her husband died not in London, as she claimed, but in Brighton, where he operated an antique shop specializing in Victorian furniture restoration." The pattern crystallized in Miss Marple's mind. Mrs. Thornfield had spent years researching and planning her claim, using her late husband's expertise to authenticate family treasures while systematically altering historical records to support her deception. Arthur's integrity and attention to detail had made him a threat to this carefully constructed fraud. Walking through the newer section of the churchyard, Miss Marple paused at a grave marked only by a temporary wooden cross. The ground showed the telltale signs of recent disturbance, not the obvious excavation of the Pemberton site, but the subtle settling that suggested something had been buried and later retrieved. A fragment of twine lay tucked in the grass, one end frayed by worried fingers, the other cut clean with something sharp. "It was opened twice," she observed to herself. "Once by someone who measures and worries, and once by someone who cuts and removes." That afternoon brought Mrs. Thornfield to Rose Cottage's garden, where she tended to her flowers with movements that seemed designed for observation. Miss Marple approached with the innocent purpose of returning a borrowed book, noting immediately the sweet scent of violets that clung to the small sitting room. On the mantelpiece stood a carte de visite photograph of a pale young woman, the name Ivy penciled carefully on the mount. "Such a pretty photograph," Miss Marple observed. "The inscription looks quite fresh." Mrs. Thornfield's composure wavered slightly. "My husband kept the family photographs in order. I've only just been sorting through them." Near the window, partially concealed among the leaves of a rubber plant, lay a small compact with mother-of-pearl inlay. A tiny chip marked one edge, precisely the size of the fragment Miss Marple had discovered at the gravesite. As evening approached, Miss Marple sat in her parlor, the accumulated evidence arranged in her mind like pieces of a complex puzzle. Mrs. Thornfield had orchestrated an elaborate deception, using genuine family connections to support fraudulent claims, while systematically eliminating any evidence that might expose her scheme. Arthur's murder had been not a crime of passion, but a calculated removal of the one person whose integrity threatened to unravel 30 years of careful planning. The brass key seemed to grow heavier in her palm, representing not just evidence of crime, but the tragic cost of human greed. Tomorrow would bring new developments, but tonight, she understood that the time for passive observation was drawing to a close. Mrs. Thornfield's increasingly desperate actions suggested she knew her deception was unraveling, and desperate people were capable of desperate measures. The next phase would require more direct engagement, a careful test that would force the truth into the open while ensuring that justice could finally be served for poor Arthur Graves. The morning light filtered through Miss Marple's lace curtains with a particular quality that suggested important decisions lay ahead. She sat at her small writing desk, the brass key with its faded purple ribbon positioned carefully beside her teacup, while she composed a brief note in her precise handwriting. The fragment of mother-of-pearl caught the sunlight from her windowsill, a silent reminder of the truth that was slowly but inexorably rising to the surface like cream in fresh milk. Her strategy would be subtle but decisive, not the elaborate trap that might alert a clever adversary, but the gentle pressure that revealed character through seemingly innocent conversation. Mrs. Thornfield had shown herself to be a woman of considerable intelligence and careful planning, but Miss Marple had observed that even the most controlled individuals possessed vulnerable points where truth leaked through their carefully constructed facades. The village fete provided the perfect opportunity. Such gatherings created natural conversations while offering multiple witnesses to any unusual reactions. Miss Marple made her way to the church hall, where Mrs. Bantry was arranging her prize-winning preserves with theatrical precision, and positioned herself at the cake stall where the flow of village life would naturally bring all the principal players within her gentle sphere of influence. Mrs. Thornfield appeared precisely as Miss Marple had anticipated, moving through the crowd with her characteristic pale elegance, though today there seemed a brittleness to her composure that suggested internal strain. The widow approached the cake stall with polite interest, her black dress softened by a delicate gray shawl that nonetheless failed to diminish the severity of her appearance. "Such a lovely gathering," Miss Marple observed mildly, selecting a small Victoria sponge with careful deliberation. These community events remind one of how interconnected village life truly is. Every family, every story, woven together like threads in a tapestry. Mrs. Thornfield's response was appropriately conventional, but Miss Marple noted the slight tension in her voice. "Indeed, Miss Marple, though some threads are better left undisturbed, don't you think?" "Oh, but that's rarely possible, dear," Miss Marple continued, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm as she spoke. "In my experience, the most carefully buried secrets have a way of working themselves to the surface. Take the Pemberton family, for instance. Such a distinguished lineage, yet recent discoveries suggest their history contains some rather interesting gaps." The reaction was subtle but unmistakable. Mrs. Thornfield's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her small handbag, and the faint scent of violets seemed to intensify around her. Miss Marple had learned to read such signs as clearly as printed words. "My nephew Raymond has been quite fascinated by his research into local family records," Miss Marple continued conversationally. "He mentioned discovering references to financial irregularities in the 1890s and the curious case of documents that seemed to vanish from official records. Such mysteries are quite compelling to a writer's imagination." Mrs. Thornfield's composure wavered slightly. "Historical research can be unreliable, Miss Marple. Family stories often become distorted over time." "True enough," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though sometimes physical evidence proves more reliable than written records. Poor Arthur Graves, for instance, had such a methodical mind when it came to preserving important items. He always said that when something truly mattered, one should hide it where no one would think to look, somewhere new rather than old, because people's assumptions follow predictable patterns." The mention of Arthur's name caused Mrs. Thornfield to draw a sharp breath. Her pale eyes darted toward the churchyard visible through the hall windows, then back to Miss Marple's gentle but penetrating gaze. "I find it curious," Miss Marple mused, examining her knitting with apparent absorption, "how certain scents can trigger such vivid memories. Violets, for instance. Such a distinctive fragrance, yet so old-fashioned now. One encounters it so rarely, except in the most carefully preserved circumstances." Mrs. Thornfield's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where Miss Marple glimpsed the edge of a small locket that likely contained the source of that persistent scent. The gesture was protective, almost defensive, and entirely unconscious. "The remarkable thing about secrets," Miss Marple continued with gentle relentlessness, "is how they connect seemingly unrelated events. A fragment of mother-of-pearl here, a brass key there, soil samples that don't quite match their supposed origins. Each detail appears insignificant alone, but together they form quite a compelling narrative." The psychological pressure was having its intended effect. Mrs. Thornfield's carefully maintained composure was beginning to crack, revealing glimpses of the desperate woman beneath the elegant facade. Her breathing had become slightly irregular, and a faint flush had appeared on her pale cheeks. "I've been wondering," Miss Marple said with deceptive casualness, "about the timing of certain recent events. Arthur's discovery of irregularities in the burial records, your arrival in the village, Raymond's commissioned research, all converging at precisely the moment when dormant legal claims might be successfully pursued. Such remarkable coincidences make one reflect on the complex motivations that drive human behavior." Mrs. Thornfield stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor with a sound that drew several curious glances. Her face had gone quite pale, and her carefully controlled voice carried a tremor that betrayed her inner turmoil. "I find I've developed a sudden headache, Miss Marple. The noise and crowd are rather overwhelming." She gathered her belongings with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. "Perhaps we might continue our conversation another time." As Mrs. Thornfield hurried toward the exit, Miss Marple observed her retreat with quiet satisfaction. The psychological test had achieved its purpose, revealing the cracks in what had seemed an impenetrable facade. The widow's reaction confirmed what the accumulated evidence had already suggested, that beneath the carefully constructed identity lay guilt, desperation, and the growing awareness that her elaborate deception was unraveling. Dr. Haydock approached as Mrs. Thornfield departed, his expression thoughtful. "Remarkable how some people react to casual conversation," he observed, "almost as though certain topics cause genuine physical distress." "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her knitting needles clicking softly, "though I suspect the distress stems not from the topics themselves, but from the implications they carry for someone with secrets to protect." Inspector Slack appeared at her elbow, having observed the interaction from across the hall. "She seemed quite agitated, Miss Marple. Do you think she's ready to break?" "Oh, I believe the breaking has already begun, Inspector. The question now is whether she will attempt to flee or make one final desperate effort to eliminate the remaining threats to her carefully constructed narrative." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes held a steely determination. "Either way, I think we shall have our answers very soon. The truth, as I've often observed, has a way of insisting upon itself, regardless of how carefully it has been buried." The afternoon sun slanted through the hall windows, casting long shadows that seemed to mirror the approaching resolution of the mystery. Mrs. Thornfield's psychological armor had been penetrated, and Miss Marple understood that the final confrontation was now inevitable. The gentle but relentless pressure of truth would soon force the complete revelation of the crimes that had cost Arthur Graves his life. The evening mist settled over St. Mary Mead with unusual density, as though the village itself were drawing a veil over the day's revelations. Miss Marple walked slowly home from the church hall, her mind turning over Mrs. Thornfield's abrupt departure and the telling signs of psychological pressure that had finally cracked the widow's carefully maintained composure. The brass key with its faded purple ribbon seemed to grow heavier in her reticule, a tangible reminder that Arthur Graves had anticipated danger and taken precautions that might yet serve justice. Inspector Slack caught up with her at her garden gate, his usual bluster replaced by thoughtful consideration. "Miss Marple, I've been reflecting on your observations about Mrs. Thornfield. Her reaction suggests we're close to something significant, but I suspect she's not finished with her deceptions yet." "Indeed, Inspector," Miss Marple replied, pausing to examine her chrysanthemums in the fading light. "Desperate people often make their most dangerous moves when they feel cornered. I believe it might be wise to provide Mrs. Thornfield with an opportunity to reveal her true intentions." She suggested, with characteristic mildness, that an announcement might be made regarding the security of certain documents overnight. "Perhaps," she mused, "if it were known that the parish registers and any related materials were being kept safely at the vicarage until the diocesan archivist could examine them properly in the morning, it might prompt someone to take decisive action." Inspector Slack's eyes sharpened with understanding. "A trap, Miss Marple." "Merely an opportunity for truth to reveal itself, Inspector." Arthur was such a methodical man. If he discovered something that threatened his safety, he would have secured it carefully. His sister mentioned he spoke of hiding things where no one would think to look, because it's new, and people's minds stay where the ivy is. I believe we may find that Arthur's precautions extended beyond what we've yet discovered. As darkness settled completely over the village, Miss Marple positioned herself at her parlor window with a clear view of both the vicarage and the church. The Reverend Clement had followed Inspector Slack's instructions perfectly, making a point of mentioning loudly to Griselda that the important documents were secured in his study until morning. The bait had been set with appropriate theatrical emphasis. Shortly after 10 o'clock, Miss Marple observed a figure moving with careful stealth along the hedge line near the vicarage. The silhouette was unmistakably feminine, and the faint scent of violets seemed to drift even through her closed window. Imagination, perhaps, but her experience had taught her that the senses often detected truth before the mind fully grasped it. The figure paused at the vicarage garden gate, then moved with practiced caution toward the study window. A small light flickered briefly, then disappeared, followed by the soft sound of careful movement and the faint scraping of metal on wood. Inspector Slack and his constable, positioned strategically in the shadows, allowed the intruder sufficient time to reveal her intentions before moving to apprehend her. The following morning brought revelations that surprised even Miss Marple with their complexity. The night's trap had indeed caught Mrs. Thornfield attempting to destroy evidence, but her target had not been the obvious documents in the vicarage study. Instead, she had been searching desperately for something that wasn't there, confirmation that Arthur's precautions had been more thorough than anyone had suspected. She was looking for a specific item, Inspector Slack reported, examining the widow's hastily abandoned handbag. A small brass key with a purple ribbon, and she seemed genuinely shocked when she couldn't locate it among the secured documents. Miss Marple produced the key from her reticule with quiet satisfaction. Arthur was indeed methodical, Inspector. If he spoke of hiding things in new places rather than old ones, perhaps we should examine the church's most recent additions. Their search led them to the new alms box in the south aisle, installed just months earlier with funds from the Restoration Appeal. The brass key turned smoothly in the small lock, revealing not coins but a carefully wrapped package bearing Arthur's distinctive handwriting. "For the vicar, should harm befall me. Evidence of deception regarding Pemberton Trust." Inside Arthur's package lay the missing piece of the puzzle, a photograph of the original ivy. Pemberton clearly showing a young woman who bore no resemblance whatsoever to Mrs. Thornfield. More damaging still was a copy of the original burial record in Arthur's careful handwriting, documenting that Ivy Pemberton had indeed been buried in 1895, but with specific personal effects that contradicted any claim of survival or lineage continuation. Most significantly, Arthur had included a small sample of the violet-scented powder found in the original grave, along with his note. The lady claiming to be descendant uses same scent as was buried with original Miss Pemberton in 1895. Suggests access to grave contents and knowledge of personal habits. Burial included family papers as suspected, but these prove Miss Pemberton died childless. Current claimant is fraud. Dr. Haydock examined the evidence with professional interest. Arthur's observations were remarkably astute. The scent connection suggests Mrs. Thornfield had indeed accessed the original grave and appropriated personal items to lend authenticity to her deception. The mother-of-pearl fragment you found, Miss Marple, likely came from the original Ivy Pemberton's personal effects. As the morning progressed, Mrs. Thornfield's desperation became increasingly apparent. She appeared at the church repeatedly, each time with different excuses. Concern for the investigation's progress, offers to assist with historical clarification, attempts to view the evidence that had been discovered. Her pale composure had given way to a barely controlled agitation that spoke of someone whose carefully constructed world was collapsing around her. "She knows we're close," Inspector Slack observed, watching the widow pace restlessly near the churchyard gate. "The question is whether she'll attempt to flee or make one final, desperate move to eliminate the remaining threats to her scheme." Miss Marple, observing from her position near the church door, noted how Mrs. Thornfield's attention kept returning to the new alms box, her pale eyes calculating distances and possibilities with the focus of someone planning decisive action. The widow's handbag seemed heavier today, and her movements carried the particular tension of someone prepared for violence. As the afternoon drew toward evening, Miss Marple understood that the final confrontation was imminent. Mrs. Thornfield had invested too much in her elaborate deception to surrender quietly, and Arthur's methodical evidence had made her position untenable. The widow would soon be forced to choose between flight and a desperate attempt to destroy the remaining evidence, along with anyone who might testify to its authenticity. The village seemed to hold its breath, as though sensing that the peaceful surface of St. Mary Mead was about to be shattered once more by the violence that lay beneath its genteel facade. Miss Marple positioned herself carefully, understanding that her role as the gentle observer was about to transform into something more direct and dangerous. The truth about Arthur Graves' murder was finally ready to emerge, but it would require one final test of will between the forces of justice and the desperate cunning of a cornered criminal. The brass key lay warm in her palm, no longer just evidence but a symbol of Arthur's integrity and foresight. Tomorrow would bring the final revelation, but tonight belonged to the gathering storm that would sweep away the last of Mrs. Thornfield's carefully constructed lies. The morning mist clung to St. Mary Mead with unusual persistence, as though the village itself were reluctant to witness the final unraveling of its carefully maintained peace. Miss Marple made her way to the parish hall, where Inspector Slack had requested the presence of all those connected to Arthur Graves's tragic death. The assembled group sat in the familiar chairs that had witnessed countless village gatherings, though today the atmosphere carried the weight of approaching revelation. Mrs. Thornfield entered with her characteristic pale composure, though Miss Marple's experienced eye noted the slight tremor in her gloved hands and the way her gaze immediately sought the positions of doors and windows. The sweet scent of violets preceded her, now seeming cloying rather than delicate in the confined space of the hall. "I believe," Miss Marple began gently, her knitting needles moving with their customary rhythm, "that we have all been somewhat confused by the complexity of recent events. It is always best, I find, to return to simple truths about human nature." She arranged the evidence carefully on the table before her. The brass key with its faded purple ribbon, the fragment of mother-of-pearl, and Arthur's carefully preserved documentation from the alms box. Poor Arthur was such a methodical man. When he discovered irregularities that troubled his conscience, he took great care to preserve the truth. Mrs. Thornfield's composure remained intact. but Miss Marple observed the almost imperceptible tightening around her pale eyes. The story begins, as so many do, with an inheritance and the length to which some will go to claim what they believe should be theirs. The Pemberton Trust, dormant for decades, represented substantial wealth to anyone who could establish legitimate claim. Raymond West shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "My research commission, that was part of it, wasn't it?" "Indeed, dear," Miss Marple confirmed with gentle understanding. "You were hired under the name Mrs. Gray to establish the historical framework that would support a fraudulent claim. Mrs. Thornfield needed both to understand the Trust's requirements and to ensure that any contradictory evidence was identified and eliminated." She turned her mild gaze toward the widow. "Your late husband's expertise in Victorian antiques provided the perfect foundation for this deception. Together, you researched the Pemberton family thoroughly, discovering that the last known beneficiary, Ivy Pemberton, had died childless in 1895 and was buried in our churchyard with significant personal effects." Dr. Haydock leaned forward with professional interest. "The violet scent, the mother-of-pearl items, they were authentic Victorian pieces." "Precisely," Miss Marple replied. Mrs. Thornfield accessed the original grave, retrieving personal effects that would lend authenticity to her assumed identity. The violet-scented powder she began wearing, the mother-of-pearl compact with its distinctive chip, all carefully appropriated to support her claim of being a Pemberton descendant. Mrs. Thornfield's breathing had become slightly irregular, though she maintained her silence with admirable control. "But your husband developed doubts about the moral implications of the scheme, didn't he, dear?" Miss Marple's voice carried infinite gentleness. "His fall down those stairs in Brighton wasn't accidental. When conscience threatened to derail 30 years of planning, you chose to proceed alone." The accusation hung in the air like incense, heavy and inescapable. Mrs. Thornfield's hands clenched in her lap, the first visible crack in her carefully maintained facade. "Arthur Graves presented a different sort of problem," Miss Marple continued. "His integrity and attention to detail made him dangerous to your scheme. You paid him £50, not for blackmail, but for services. You needed him to help you access the grave contents systematically, to retrieve any documents that might contradict your claim." Inspector Slack nodded grimly. "But Arthur discovered the truth. He found the original burial documentation proving Ivy Pemberton died childless, along with the photograph showing she bore no resemblance to Mrs. Thornfield. Arthur's methodical nature led him to secure copies of this evidence in the new arms box, where he believed no one would think to look." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she regarded Mrs. Thornfield with compassionate understanding. "When Arthur confronted you with his discoveries, you struck him down with your compact, the mother-of-pearl inlay, leaving the distinctive wound Dr. Haydock noted. You then attempted to destroy the evidence by tampering with the parish registers and searching desperately for Arthur's hidden documentation." The psychological pressure had finally achieved its purpose. Mrs. Thornfield's carefully constructed composure crumbled completely, revealing the calculating desperation beneath her elegant facade. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible. 30 years of research, of planning. The trust could have provided security for life. Arthur was going to destroy everything for the sake of some misguided principle. "But principles, dear, are what separate us from mere cleverness," Miss Marple replied gently. "Arthur understood that truth matters more than comfort, that integrity cannot be purchased with any amount of money." As Inspector Slack moved forward to make the arrest, Mrs. Thornfield looked around the familiar parish hall with the expression of someone seeing her world collapse entirely. The elaborate deception that had cost 2 lives and consumed decades of planning had been undone by the simple integrity of a village sexton and the patient observation of an elderly woman with knitting needles and an understanding of human nature. Later, as the autumn shadows lengthened across St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple sat once more on her familiar bench near the church wall. The village would heal, as villages always did, though it would carry the quiet scars of this tragedy. She reflected that beneath the genteel surface of ordinary life lay the eternal struggle between good and evil, played out in the complex motivations of people faced with extraordinary temptations. The brass key with its faded purple ribbon had been returned to its proper place in the church records, but its lesson would endure. Truth, like cream in fresh milk, inevitably rises to the surface, no matter how carefully it has been buried beneath layers of deception and violence. Arthur Graves could rest peacefully now, his methodical nature having provided the evidence needed to ensure that justice was finally served.